Alrighty, welcome back, and we're now going to talk about the Americas prior to contact between natives and Europeans. So we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so this is the Americas prior to European discovery, aka invasion, if you want to characterize it that way, which you definitely can. So we're going to very briefly do a little discussion of what's mostly in the realm of archaeology. So if you're interested in more of this, I recommend you take archaeology, archaeology of North America, which will go into much more depth. So the first thing we want to just hit home here is that history and archaeology are very different disciplines, even though they both relate to the past. History requires documents that are written in a decipherable language. So without written documents in a language that the historian can comprehend, you don't have history, you have archaeology. So Native Americans left very little evidence of written languages, although some discoveries have been made. The Mayans had some kind of written language. Still, we can't read it terribly accurately. And so the study of ancient peoples prior to the advent of writing about them or by them is in the realm of archaeology. So archaeologists have it both easier and harder than historians in some ways. On the one hand, they have to try to deduce what artifacts might have been and what they were used for with very little contextual information. So they have to take an artifact, which is a thing that you find in a dig when you're doing an archaeological excavation, and they have to try to figure out what that was based on the other things they found around it. And that's pretty difficult in that there's no instruction manuals or anything like that to tell you what the stuff is. On the other hand, they can speculate far more than historians can. Historians don't get away with much speculating. We can't just make stuff up as much. Not that archaeologists make stuff up, they make very educated deductions. But they're still deductions nonetheless, they're guesses. And historians have to utilize facts that are written in documentary evidence for their interpretations. So historians need some kind of written documentation. They can't just speculate too much. The more historians speculate, the more it becomes fiction. So to illustrate this, I usually use this item here. And we do an exercise with this if you take in History 201 about what this item might have been if you just found it by itself. And this item is plastic, and it fits in the palm of your hand, and it looks like this little three-pronged device. And so what would a future civilization think of this if you just found this in the ground somewhere at some archaeological site? A future civilization with no knowledge of our civilization might not know that this is the thing that goes in a pizza box. So keep the paper out of the cheese, and not just any pizza box, but the cheap ones where the cardboard falls in or the paper falls in. So the better pizza places will use the tougher cardboard boxes that have more structure. So a future civilization might not figure this out. And so we want to keep in mind that when we study Native Americans of the prehistorical era, we might be interpreting them incorrectly. And indeed, we do often find out things that are incorrect about them. Or, excuse me, we find out things that we thought were correct that turn out not to be correct all the time, that our assumptions were wrong. So one thing to think about with natives, and I'll post this this clip here, is that the idea that time is different for them. So when we study Native American history, Not all natives have the same conception of time that Westerners do. We have a very Western conception of time, and not all natives share that. So they look at time differently. They look at the passage of lifetimes differently, and it's a very westernized thing. And so one problem that historians that study Native Americans have to deal with is that their conception of time is different. And so when we speak of, what natives were doing in the year 1519 or whatever, they don't necessarily think in those same terms. I mean, just our calendar is based on, the numbers that we use for our years is based on a westernized construct that's based on, we call it CE, current era now, but it's basically the same thing as BC, before Christ. And that's very much a westernized religious concept, which obviously natives don't share. Not all natives share. So Native American scholar and activist Vina Deloria argues that native stories are what he called geomythology. He said that if geologists who study the Earth can use sophisticated means to date core samples of soil and rocks, that should not disqualify native stories as having similar value as a dating technique. And he, in fact, argued that some native stories quite precisely describe the geologic creation of volcanoes and mountains and craters. For example, Crater Lake. There's a native legend about how that was created. That's actually not that different from the geological investigations that we've done. And so, in that sense, the science confirmed the oral traditions of the natives. So, many native peoples argue that the geologic record of when they traveled from Asia or whatever, which is what is in most history textbooks, many of them argue that natives were always in North America, and it makes their heritage and their connection to the land stronger. They argue we were always here since time immemorial, since the Creator made them. And there are many different creation stories, some of which you looked at in the exercise from Unit 1, and I'll have this YouTube linked to the next module so you can see one of the creation stories. So this is an image of the Sky Woman here by a native artist, and I think you read about the Sky Woman in one of the native documents.